so much for attending today's Coffee and Conservation. I'm Nicole Killian, and I'm the founder of SUP Englewood. I'm really glad that you're here today with us. This series is something that's so important to me. I brought this together so that way we can unite as a community and learn about conservation issues that are impacting our area over a cup of coffee and have some really great conversations about conservation. So before we get started, I just want to move into a few quick housekeeping tips. Could we all just take a minute and silence our phones? Let's make sure that we can give our full attention to our speaker today. I want to give a big shout out to Chris at the Dearborn Coffee House. They're located on Dearborn Street, and they help fuel all of our presentations with coffee and pastries. And then I want to give a huge shout out also to the Chamber of Commerce. We have our executive director, Doug, in the back here, and they graciously allow us to use this room every month for this series. So they allow us to host here. So thank you so much for that. Just a quick reminder, the Coffee and Conservation series is the third Tuesday of every month at 9 a.m. And if you haven't already signed up for some of the upcoming ones, I want to just give you a quick rundown on what some of those sessions are going to be. And also, if you missed any of our previous talks, I'm a little bit slow at adding it to the YouTube, but slowly and surely they are getting added onto YouTube. You just look for SUP Englewood on YouTube, and then there's a series for coffee and conservation there. And if you're able to, we are accepting donations today. The donations always go to the presenting nonprofit. Today's nonprofit is Captains for Clean Water, so all donations will go there. And again, that bucket is there on that back table. So here's a look at what's ahead. In the following month, September, we have Armando Ubeda returning. If you remember, he did a shark presentation for us. He is coming back, and this time he's going to speak about horseshoe monitoring, and he is from the Florida Sea Grant in Sarasota County. And then we have in October, Carol McCoy. She was with us in March for sea turtles. She's returning in October for gopher tortoise conservation. In November, we have Joellen Wilson of Bonefish and Tarpon Trust. She did a presentation with us last November. Now she's going to be coming back to give us an update and discuss the juvenile tarpon habitat restoration efforts around the Cape Hayes Peninsula and Coral Creek areas into Charlotte Harbor. So she has some new updates. They had some new land that they were able to acquire, and she's gonna really have a wonderful presentation for us on that. So if you haven't already, RSVP. So now that I have all of that out of the way, I'm most excited to highlight today's special guest, Captains for Clean Water. Their organization was founded during one of our area's biggest nightmares, the red tide catastrophe of 2018. This was a heartfelt time for all of us that were here living in Florida, witnessing the disaster occurring in our waterways. I knew of some of the issues that took place in the past for Lake Okeechobee, and I had seen photos and videos of similar issues happening on the east coast of Florida. But experiencing it here on the West Coast in my hometown was a whole new level of devastation. There's an immense gratitude that I feel towards Captains for Clean Water and their founders for stepping up at a time when we needed it most to protect Florida's waterways. Captain Chris Whitman is one of the co-founders of Captains for Clean Water, and he continues to protect Florida waterways to ensure disasters like this never happen again through his advocacy and leadership. So please join me in welcoming Captain Chris Whitman today. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you to the Chamber for hosting us, opening up the doors here. We appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity and including us in this. So, I'm Captain Chris Whitman. I am a fourth generation Floridian. I grew up on a little island south of here called Sanibel, and I was a fishing guide by trade. Grew up on an island. My mom grew up on Estero Island, Fort Myers Beach. And so my whole life growing up was literally surrounded by the water, and naturally I wanted to, my father's a general contractor, so went to work for the family business, and I can remember standing on, the roof of a house, framing trusses and looking down at the fishing guide, fishing the mangrove shoreline across the way and thinking, that's really where I belong. And I need to figure out how I could spend my time in the place I love and still pay bills. And so in the year 2000, I walked away from family business to become a fishing guide. And it was my dream job, best job you could have. And you're not, a lot of people think fishing guide, your job is to catch fish or help people catch fish. Your job's really to create an experience for somebody that's probably the highlight of their entire year. So one time where they unplug from work or stresses of, what's going on in the real world, you kind of become the role of somewhere between a guide and a therapist and a friend, and and so it's a very special job. And so I did that for many years. That led me to traveling the country, fishing tournaments for ESPN. Ended up producing and hosting a nationally broadcasted television show, kind of outdoor show, hunting and fishing, and sharing again kind of what those pursuits and experiences mean to people and how they impact people's lives. And so even all my involvement and base around our water and around our environment, I was not really involved in a meaningful way on advancing solutions to issues that I had seen my entire life. The grass flats that I fished as a kid and the oyster bars that I fished as a kid at the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River, by the time I was guiding, no longer existed. They were gone. And the area that was the most productive fishery for me growing up, you would drive right by it because it wasn't worth fishing anymore. And so even all of that, I was not meaningfully involved. And it wasn't until 2016 that we had a massive water crisis that was kind of the catalyst for me to really step back and look at what was going on, what the future of my way of life looked like, and what the future of, to me, what Florida really looked like. And it was not pleasant. It was a scary time. So before I get really into that journey, who here was around for that 2016 or 2018 water crisis? And who here is familiar with it in any way? So 2016, we had massive discharges from Lake Okeechobee that we would get every 2 to 3 years. And it basically decimates our fishery. 2 ways. Nutrient-laden, polluted fresh water. Those nutrients, if they come in contact with red tide, Carenia brevis, is fuel. And so it just takes what would normally be a natural red tide bloom that would, spur up off the coast here generally, eat itself out of food, and then dissipate, is fueled to where it lasts for months or even over a year, and the toxicity levels get so high that it starts to kill everything. It affects your breathing, and so the pollution part's one part of it. The other part is just simply the volume of fresh water that was being sent down the river dropped salinity levels in the estuary for over 30 days at a time, and that's what killed all those oyster beds and seagrass beds, was the fact that you took a saltwater ecosystem and turned it fresh for 90 days. And that's the lasting, the very visual is the red tide, but the real lasting impact that lasts for decades is that imbalance that this put into our system. And so the reason that happened is 100 years ago, people thought, they looked at our land different, and they thought it was a great idea. Let's conquer the land. Let's drain worthless swamp so that we can develop it and live in places like this and grow agricultural crops in the wintertime. And it set forth an effort to drain the Everglades. And in doing so, it took several decades, and it wasn't really until the early to mid 1900s that the government got involved after a major hurricane of 1929 that killed thousands of people, and really put forth the motion that is our Everglades system today, which is one that is fragmented and compartmentalized and very much controlled, and not at all with the natural landscape. Naturally, before man put his hands on the Everglades, water would flow from the Kissimmee River Basin, south of Orlando, down to Lake Okeechobee, would overflow its southern banks, and that water would slowly flow through the river of grass, as Marjorie Stoneman Douglas called it, down to the Everglades, what we know as the Everglades National Park today, and ultimately Florida Bay and the Keys. And in draining that area south of Lake Okeechobee, they dug canals out to the Atlantic Ocean to bleed the water out of the river of grass. They put up levees and barriers of flow. They then connected Lake Okeechobee to the Caloosahatchee River and to the St. Lucie River, because the water that once flowed through that river of grass now had to have somewhere else to go, and it would go to the East Coast and the West Coast. And so that action, that started a century ago, really was what started this process of decline. And it was sending water where it wasn't needed and depriving that water where it was desperately needed. And so what we have today is the Everglades gets too dry, Florida Bay gets too salty because it doesn't have that constant freshwater input, and then the East and the West Coast get times when it gets way too fresh because all that water is being dumped into our estuary. And so to get back, give you a little history on, what happened to get us to the point of where we were in 2016. And as a fishing guide, I didn't worry about policy or politics or science. I worried about which way the wind was blowing and what the water temperature was and what the moon phase was, what type of clients I had that day and what they would find enjoyable. And so, I got it. So as a fishing guide, this was like the highlight of your year. This is a tarpon. Basically, my world revolved around this fish. And typically, we would fish for these, right around March through about the 4th of July. It's kind of the peak. Peak being like May and early June. But 2016, this was New Year's Day. And it's a big fish, about an hour and a half. This fish was right off the beach of Sanibel Island, close to the Fort Myers beach, kind of near the lighthouse of Sanibel Island. About an hour later, we got a double. And this kid on the right here, his name is Thomas. His grandmother has a house on Captiva, and he would come down and spend the holidays with her, and she would hire me to take him fishing ever since he was a little guy. And so here we were, him and one of his friends, with a double on tarpon on New Year's Day, and we were like, this is going to be an incredible tarpon season. And as a fishing guide at that point, 16 years into my career, was, hey, we made the right choice. This is amazing. A couple weeks later, the Army Corps of Engineers started dumping water out of Lake Okeechobee because it was too high. And this is the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River. You can see that turbid, muddy water. You couldn't see, 6 inches into the water. And it sent a plume of water out off of Sanibel all the way down to Marco Island and all the way up out Little Gasparilla Pass. And this is what that plume looked like on an incoming tide. So you had that real defined tide line pushing against it. If you see this, here is Fort Myers Beach. Here's the bridge to Fort Myers Beach, and Sanibel Lighthouse is right over here. Those tarpon that were caught were right about here. And so within just a few weeks, we went from what we thought was going to be just the best season ever to completely shut down. What came after that was, after about 30 days or so, entire grass beds shed their blades. And this is an entire grass flat that I fished as a guide floating out to tide. still to this day has not recovered, still dead. This was blue-green algae bloom on Lake Okeechobee. And so this is where red tide is a saltwater organism, Crania brevis. This is a freshwater harmful algae bloom. And the unique thing about blue-green algae is it has toxins that are now linked to neurodegenerative diseases, ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. And so this was, with those discharges from Lake Okeechobee, this was coming along with it. This is it, packed into a marina by the wind and starts to, just explode, and it's gnarly. Not knowing what I know now about blue-green algae, this is myself, shadow of myself and the other co-founder, about a mile from my house. And we were collecting this blue-green algae into mason jars so that we could take it to show policymakers. News media, this was national news, international news. My days went from taking people fishing to taking media out to see what was happening. And that was really kind of, at that point in time, the mindset was like, if you shine a bright spotlight on this, you're going to hurt business, you're going to hurt tourism, you're going to hurt our communities. But the reality was, and that was the perspective I had as a fishing guide up until that point. But, my parents' best friends, my second grandfather owned Fishtail Marina on Fort Myers Beach. And so directly affected. But the reality was, what we saw was people were saving up their entire year to come here on vacation, or they were saving up their entire lives to move here and retire here. And they have an experience like this, and they leave, and they do not come back. They go somewhere else. And so that kind of short-sighted mentality of like, don't talk about these issues because it hurts our business, was the mentality we had that got us to that point. And we saw what had happened. We had clients that, Thomas's grandmother sold her house. She moved. Clients had fished with me for, 15 years, started going somewhere else. And so this was, the red tide bloom that followed in the weeks after that. And, I know Dawn just says she likes to go diving with whale sharks and talk about the severity and the toxicity of this bloom. It wasn't just killing bait fish. It was killing everything, from benthic life down in the bottom, worms and eels and creatures you never seen. Crabs by the tens of thousands were crawling out of the water to get away from it, dying on the beach, to a 27-foot whale shark that washed up behind my friend's hotel, Sanibel Island Inn on Sanibel. Clearly, obviously, when that's going on, you've got front-end loaders and dump trucks driving up and down the beach collecting marine life. Not real good for business. And at the height of our tourism season, that's what was going on. This whale shark was so big, they had to bring an excavator in and just bury it right there on the spot on the beach because they couldn't move it. And so we had this massive impact, and that was really the catalyst to look at ourselves and figure out, why is this still happening, and why is it happening? And coincidentally, the year I became a fishing guide, in the year 2000, a plan was put into law, a bipartisan plan, signed into law, a partnership between the state of Florida and the federal government, between Governor Jeb Bush and President Bill Clinton, saying we are going to restore the Everglades. We're going to reconnect that system that we fragmented, that we held all the water back to develop this area south, and in turn, we discharge all that water out the east and west coast. And so hundreds of scientists, engineers, hydrologists got together, and they made the world's largest ecosystem restoration plan in the history of the world. And it's right here. Everglades Restoration. It's a comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. And it's 68 infrastructure projects that remove barriers to flow, reconnect Lake Okeechobee back to the Everglades and Florida Bay, and in doing so, stop the discharges to the east and west coast. And it was estimated that those 68 projects, and this is what the idea here is, it's not to flood anything that's developed here. It's just creating ways for water, Lake Okeechobee's polluted water, move it through large canals into engineered wetlands, STAs, basically man-made filter marshes, let the plants in those marshes take up that pollution and nutrients, and then send clean water out of those wetlands, out of those engineered wetlands, back down to the Everglades. And in doing so, you reduce the discharges to the east and west coast, and you rehydrate Florida Bay, the Biscayne Aquifer, which is the drinking water supply for 9 million Floridians. And so here we were, 2000. I was just becoming a fishing guide. They signed this law, this agreement into law, and it was estimated it would take 30 years to complete all these massive projects.
So we're almost done, right?
So in the year 2016, in the year 2016, we're just past the halfway point, and not a single project had been done.
Because I've been here for 10 years. I came from California. I've been hearing about this since I came.
Yep.
Keep waiting for them to get off their butt and do something.
That's right. So what we figured out was why? Why are we 16 years in? And look, we're fishing guides and we're pissed off. And you know, we weren't gonna hear it. You ever heard the story about how fishing guides are such good storytellers? You know, we can tell when we were being BS'd. And we went and met with policymakers, and we could tell that's exactly what was happening, and it made us angry. And we started calling scientists that we had relationships with, that we worked on with tagging programs as fishing guides. We started calling people, and what we found out was it wasn't a science problem. Science had been settled 20 years before that. It wasn't an engineering problem. They had the largest engineering firm in the world, the Army Corps of Engineers, put together a plan of how to build these infrastructure projects and in what sequence to build them. It was a political will problem. And so there was no political will to advance these projects because the industrial sugarcane industry south of the lake benefited from the status quo of how water was managed. If Lake Okeechobee was managed as a reservoir and they just held water back in the lake until it got so full that they had to dump it out the east and west coast, they could treat that as their own private reservoir and have guaranteed 3 times as much water as they would ever need, and be guaranteed perfect growing conditions. And then when we had excessively wet years, they would be provided perfect drainage, and all that water would be shunted off that land down into here, flooding the water conservation areas. If you saw earlier last year how the Miccosukee tribes and all their tree islands, everything was flooded because you took 3 feet of water that would have been in this 500,000 acres, and you put it all in this 500,000 acres that already had 3 feet of water in it. Now this was 6 feet deep, flooding everything out. And so that management of water, prioritizing one special interest over the rest of Florida's stakeholders, was what was happening. And the reason it could happen was, look, they're very connected, politically powerful industry, really 2 companies. So very easily, Big Sugar, very easily for them to align and put money into politics to just kick the can down the road and do ancillary projects and come up with, you know, ancillary solutions, Band-Aids on symptoms instead of fixing the real issue. And what we found was the void that was allowing that to happen was public pressure. People like myself and Daniel, who are fishing guides who grew up on an island, were not involved. And we were not speaking up and saying, this is affecting us. Not this is killing tarpon and sea turtles and dolphins and whale sharks, saying this is killing my business. And the tens of thousands of people around the state of Florida that was affecting, none of us were speaking up. And the reason we weren't speaking up wasn't because we weren't affected, and it wasn't because we didn't care. We just did not have a mechanism to understand what was happening, understand the opportunities that needed to happen, and use our voice to authentically say this ecological problem and mismanagement is causing an economic impact. And that's the language that policymakers can understand and can justify putting billions of dollars into Everglades restoration. So they simply weren't funding it to the levels that needed to be funded, and they were doing things that were addressing the symptoms, right? We got some innovative technology gizmo that's gonna bubble the algae bloom out of this marina. Like you had a heart attack, you fell down and hit your head, and the solution is to put a Band-Aid on your head. Like that's not fixing the problem. So we realized that why weren't we involved? And it was, one, education. We needed, if we had a better understanding of the problem, of the solutions that existed, and the role that our individual voices played, we would be involved. And then also, look, everybody has to go about their lives. Whether you have families or there's a lot going on. So we have to have an effective, efficient mechanism to take people in, educate them, bring them on a journey that they can relate to, and then give them an effective way to use their voice when their voice is needed, letting them know about an opportunity, like funding Everglades restoration, or letting them know about a threat, like a bad piece of water policy that will threaten progress. And so that's why we formed Captains for Clean Water, was to create public pressure, get our arms around all the different individual stakeholders, educate them, empower them to become advocates for themselves and their businesses and their way of life, and then give them a mechanism to keep them up to date on what was happening and give them a way to use their voice when their voice was needed. And so that was our philosophy, that if everybody knew about this problem, we wouldn't have been in the position we were. And if everybody knew about it and they had a way to use their voice, there would be so much public pressure that the lobbyists walking around Tallahassee and DC handing out campaign checks couldn't be as effective. There's no better disinfectant than sunlight. So shine sunlight on this political issue. And so that was our philosophy, and we built the organization to do that. And it very quickly, that was 2016. Over the next couple years, over the next 2 years, that was our focus. And we basically walked away from our dream jobs to fight this. We knew that this wasn't something that we would be effective at. We just were consumed with it. And just like we had given our jobs as fishing guides 100% focus, we shifted that focus to this. And so 2018 happened, another even worse water crisis. Hurricane Irma had come in, put a ton of water into Lake Okeechobee, massive discharges, red tide bloom that lasted over a year, completely crippling the economy. Hotels completely vacant, restaurants vacant, laying off employees. And so we built the organization to empower informed stakeholders. And so the first real proof of concept, and we made a lot of progress. We got the cornerstone project in Everglades restoration, the EAA reservoir. It's a massive reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee down here that will take Lake Okeechobee's water, put it into that reservoir, clean it through a filter marsh, and then send that clean water south, reducing those discharges. That was the most politically challenging project in the whole suite of 68 projects. We got that through, and that bill passed to start that project in 2017. And then 2018 happened, and so this huge momentum, this huge movement blew up. It's kind of right place at the right time. We were able to harness all that energy and really make a ton of progress. And there was a gubernatorial race at the time. Water quality became the top polling issue. Not just for the governor's race, but I mean, you could be running for dog catcher and people at town halls were like, what are you going to do about water quality? It was very contentious. And so we had started making all this progress. That project was being built. It was funded. We saw Everglades restoration funding on the state level going from $45 to $65 million a year to today it's over $1 billion a year. We saw funding from the federal level going from even less than that to, $450, $460 million a year. So we started seeing this massive progress. Everglades restoration projects happening at lightning pace because of public pressure. And then here we were, all of a sudden, I believe this was the end of session 2022, a bill was filed. We got in that time frame, the governing board of the South Florida Water Management District, who was largely, that organization, agency was built to restore the Everglades and control the water, and they were largely making decisions on behalf of the sugar industry. We got, that whole entire governing board was replaced when DeSantis took office because of this water issue. The chairman of that board is Chauncey Goss from Boca Grande Island. Grew up on Sanibel. His father, Porter Goss, was one of the congressmen who signed Everglades restoration into law. And so all this momentum happened, and then this bill gets filed, Senate Bill 2508. And it wasn't filed at the beginning of session where it would go through multiple committee stops and the public can weigh in. It was filed at about 8:30 on a Friday night as a conforming bill to the governor's budget, meaning it was tied to the budget, and it would see a single committee, an appropriations committee, the following Wednesday, and that was it. And in that bill was a series of sentences that would take the funding that was dedicated to that EAA reservoir, make it available to other projects. So you halt its progress by spending the money on other things. It took the decision-making ability of the South Florida Water Management District's governing board and made it to where their rule decisions had to be approved by, guess who? The Florida legislature, who takes tens of millions of dollars from sugar. And then there was all these other things. So it was really, really bad bill. Filed last minute in the dark of night, quite literally, where the public, there would be one opportunity for public pressure, to create public pressure. And because we had spent the previous 4 years building an educated army that knew, like, we can go about our daily business, but if we ring that alarm bell, some of the fishing guys say, if you light the bat signal, you have to show up. Like we have to show up. And that's what we did. We made this aware to the public, and these are all fishing guides and hospitality industry people who canceled their charters, $1,200 a day for a couple days, towed boats up, parked their boats on the front lawn of the Capitol in Tallahassee. You can see multiple news agencies showed up. And, you know, mind you, this is 4 years after a water crisis. So it wasn't like there was this big crisis. These people were there and were plugged in, and they were ready to take action because of the education and advocacy work building that foundation. And so that really was the first example of that philosophy that the resources we could bring into the organization, our team's time, talent, and the funding, the treasure that allows us to scale that, we can create these outputs of the organization, educational campaigns, advocacy campaigns, and relationships so that when, you know, we had to drop what we were doing and go somewhere, we can pick up the phone and have an army of people show up. And so that, you know, we talked about that Senate Bill 10, which was the passing of the funding for the EAA reservoir. In the process, just before this, was LOSOM, so Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, so a new management plan of how the Army Corps would manage Lake Okeechobee, reducing the discharges to the coast, sending as much water possible through south to the Everglades as infrastructure could handle it. So the more infrastructure that comes online, the more you can push through. And then state and federal appropriations, and all of those things result in better water policy, reduction in discharges, increase in flowing water south. And that Senate Bill 2508 was going to threaten, kind of put us back. And so we launched a campaign. Over 55 days, we built social media campaigns. We put together calls to action, petition. We took trips to the state capitol. And we did a lot of PR and media outreach to create massive public pressure in opposition to that bill. So that bill then was amended down, was still bad. It wasn't as bad, but it was still bad, right? So it was amended down, and it passed the Senate almost unanimously. There was only 2 nay votes. One Republican, one Democrat, both of them were terming out and no longer cared about the political impacts of voting against Big Sugar. And so we launched a social media campaign. We went there to testify, and on our YouTube channel, there's a film about this. But all these fishing guides and business owners, the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce at Sanibel Captiva, John Lai, all these people went and testified to that committee where they were going to be given 3 minutes to speak in public comment. And as people started speaking, the chair of that committee cut their time down to 30 seconds. And then they were told they were misinformed. They didn't know what they were talking about. Don't worry, we've got you, and the typical like Tallahassee doublespeak. And one after one after one, these people went up and testified, and we documented it. And we used some of the footage from the Florida channel. You've probably seen it, right? Shows you can watch in real time some of the stuff that's going on in Tallahassee. We used some of that footage to put some content out. That's a taxpayer-funded channel managed by the Senate. And I don't know, 24 hours later, we got a cease and desist, threatening criminal charges for using their, intellectual property. And so we launched a campaign saying they're trying to censor our voices. They're cutting our time down to 30 seconds. They're telling you don't know. They're trying to censor us. And so all these fishing guides, instead of holding fish, started putting up censored bars over their fish. And this went completely viral. Millions of people, all across the country, started doing this. And so this part of this campaign went viral. The calls to action from February 8th to March 31st, these are all the people that took action asking the Senate to not support this bill. You can see it's very, very, if you're looking to win a Florida election, this, and this is where you have to win votes. Down here and over here is where you get your funding. So, very, very impactful. If you're looking at a federal election, same thing, and you see the support for Everglades restoration isn't a Florida issue. People took action from every single congressional district at the United States Congress. And so over the course of those few weeks, these numbers are actually a little less because we didn't wrap this up at the very end, but it was about 13 million people we reached. 750,000 people visited our website, crashed our website a couple times. 50,000 people took action. And that impact, that bill passed, and the governor was coming down to, I think, Rookery Bay. Daniel and I were able to, last minute, get a private sit down with him, say, hey, this is not good. And here's all the people that think this is not good. The politicians in Tallahassee, they're kept in a bubble of what reality is versus what's out there. And so it was kind of like, well, seemed like everything was amended down, whatever. And so they passed that bill. The governor, it came to his desk. He didn't do anything with it. Let it sit on the desk, negotiated all the horse trading that went on in Tallahassee. And then right at the end, when he was, wrapping up his final stuff, he came down to Fort Myers Beach to Dock Fords, surrounded by, a bunch of fishing guides. This is Chauncey Goss. He's the chairman of the South Florida Water Management District. John Lai, CEO of the chamber. This is secretary of DEP. And then Daniel, myself, my 2-year-old baby boy at the time, and a bunch of fishing guides. And he vetoed that bill as a result of the amount of public pressure. And so that was the real first proof of concept that authentic voices can drive enough public pressure to override the influence of one of the most politically powerful entities in the state of Florida. And so understanding that, we figured how can we really put more juice behind this effective model? And so in partnership with the Chamber on Sanibel Island, Everglades Foundation, Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, and Captains for Clean Water, we built a leadership program called Preserving Paradise, basically to take executives from the hospitality industry, the tourism industry, real estate industry, and take them through a 6-week course on Everglades restoration, water quality, how it is moving, what the challenges and hurdles it has to overcome are, and then have those business leaders knowledgeable and empowered to then be able to go to Tallahassee or Washington, D.C. with us to advocate, like we were talking about earlier, on funding for Everglades restoration every year, making sure it continues to be funded, or stopping bad water policy, bad legislation, or weighing in on a new management plan for Lake Okeechobee. And they're able to go there and speak in a language that policymakers understand. This is about the jobs of my employees and the revenue of my community. And so we developed that program to do that. Cultivate and empower business leaders, CEOs, executive, presidents of banks, to go through this process. And it's going on, I literally am going from here to a Preserving Paradise meeting that is going on right now to present this afternoon. And so this is our year 2 of that. We also did an economic study just in here in Lee, Charlotte, and Collier County on the impacts of that 2018 red tide bloom, to be able to give real numbers and data to policymakers looking at investing billions of dollars into Everglades restoration. And you look at it, just that one event, $17.8 billion in lost property values. So the real estate industry, or just the value of your own home, 43,000 jobs lost. 43,000 jobs. Coastal economic output just in those 3 regions, 5.2 billion. Property tax revenue loss, 60 million. Outdoor recreation, 8.1 billion. We're just in these 3 counties. That's not the East Coast. It's not the Keys, Florida Bay. If you look at that 2018 water crisis, Jacksonville had a 15% economic decline. There was no water quality issue there. So it's affecting economically the entire state and the entire country. People who are traveling here from across the country are spending money to get here. They're spending money on, everything from sunglasses to coolers to fishing rods or whatever it is to come here. And so that philosophy that, educating and empowering stakeholders who can articulate the connection between the ecological issues that got us to get involved and the economic impact those issues were having through their own lens is the only mechanism that can overcome massive special interests. And so that's what we built the organization to fill that void. There had been great science organizations working on this for 30 years before, and they were beating their head against the wall because no progress was happening. And so we just, we didn't come in to create science or do water studies or test water or clean beaches. We came in to educate and empower people to fill that void, to create public pressure. And it's proven to be what was needed. And so today, over 60 of those 68 projects are under construction, have hit a major milestone, or have been completed. That EAA reservoir, which is larger than Manhattan. You could put the entire island, the entire city of Manhattan, inside of that reservoir. And it's a 30-foot tall, above-ground reservoir that'll take that water, store it, and then push it through the filter marsh, which is, that reservoir is 10,000 acres. The filter marsh is 6,500 acres. And so that filter marsh is completed and has water sitting in it today, and plants are growing in. And so, the progress that has happened is amazing, but the challenge is not allowing our communities to get complacent when we've now been 7 years without a water crisis. We now have new people that have moved here that maybe didn't live through that water crisis, or we just get complacent because it's not right there in front of our face, knowing that if we let our foot off the gas, everything can come to a grinding halt. And even once all these projects are completed, they have to be managed to get full capacity out of them. If we all turn back away and now you have a $4 billion reservoir that could be used as an irrigation reservoir for sugar instead of water supply for the Everglades, so even once these projects are done, you can't take your eye off the ball, your foot off the gas. And it's really important for us to build that understanding and knowledge through education to the community. It's why we do things like this today. It's why we build programs like Preserving Paradise. And so, those threats to our water quality will remain into perpetuity. It's a matter of how much the public that make up these communities understands those threats and are willing to engage. And so right now, as we speak, we haven't had a call to action lighting the bat signal since that 2508, several years. But right now, the sugar industry is proposing to put a 8,600 acre rock mine directly next to that reservoir. So the soil in the southern part of that system, through decades of drying it out, oxidizing that peat soil, they've run out of soil. It's hitting caprock. No longer productive to grow sugarcane, which is, valuable to them only because it's federally subsidized, and massive price floor and import tariffs and a whole nother, corporate welfare deal. But they've run out of soil, so they're looking at what is the next resource to extract from that. And mining is prohibited in that area unless you have to mine to build a water resource project like Everglades restoration. Well, the Army Corps didn't seek out a project. The South Florida Water Management District didn't seek out a project. The sugar industry, who has fought these projects tooth and nail through a contractor, filed an unsolicited proposal, filed a proposal for a project that no one asked for, which is a rock mine that they are calling a water resource project, because 40 years from now, when they're done dynamite blasting all the rock out of there and they're left with a hole in the ground, they'll then turn it over to the state as a water resource project. In addition to that, they're going to seek appropriations for the state taxpayers to pay them to mine the rock for the next 40 years. And so, one, just the fact of, and this isn't a new thing. This happened with they call it the C51 reservoir, where it was proposed as a privately funded project. And then once they got approval, they went to the state for appropriations. That project's happening today. If you drive across State Road 80 over to West Palm Beach, as soon as you come right before you come into West Palm Beach, it's on your left-hand side right there. But that's cost all of the taxpayers of Florida over $300 million now to this year. And so, well over 300 million. And so this is one of those threats that the financial threat, the threat to the aquifer, the ecological threat, but most importantly, what is 30 years of blasting right next to an above ground reservoir going to do to the integrity of the reservoir? Just last year, the sugar industry sued the Army Corps of Engineers over that reservoir, saying you can build that reservoir, but we should be entitled to that water. We should get access to the water before it's available to the Everglades. So go ahead and build a $4 billion reservoir, but before you send that water to the Everglades, you need to ask us if we want it first, which means you have to hold that water in there through dry season when the Everglades needs it as a backup emergency supply for them. And then what it means is, once you get through dry season and sugar says, yeah, we don't need it, go ahead. Well, now you're in wet season when the Everglades has the water it needs, and now there's no capacity in the reservoir to take water from Lake Okeechobee. So it renders it completely useless. And so that comes to the operations of it. And so they sued the Army Corps over that. They lost at the district level. We filed an amicus brief on behalf of the Corps. The judge cited our amicus in his decision, in his ruling. Then they appealed it, and it went to the 11th Circuit in Atlanta, where a panel of judges I think referred to their arguments as strange, and they lost that as well. So here we are a few months after them suing over this massive project, this massive reservoir, all of a sudden saying, hey, we've got a great idea. We want to build a reservoir for you. It doesn't add up. And what it will do is, if it causes that reservoir to leak, and you've got a hole in the ground, and they have access to that water, Florida's limestone, it's like a sponge, it's porous. So you pump water out of this hole and you got this big bucket of water here. What's it going to do? It's going to migrate right down through, and you basically can take the water out of the reservoir without having a pump in the reservoir. And so jeopardizing that, and since that's happened, they've greased the political skids to fast track that through. There was a new process put into law on how unsolicited proposals would move through the process. They were the first project to be filed 24 hours after that process was put into law. It required the South Florida Water Management District to identify the proposed project as a valid water resource project. It required the Palm Beach County, the county would send to do a zoning change and permit to allow for the mining because it was a water resource project. And then it would require DEP to issue a mining permit. And what happened was the applicant, U.S. Sugar, Florida Crystals, and Phillips and Jordan, the construction company, sold this off. They had, through metadata, an investigative journalist found that the letter from the South Florida Water Management District that was leveraged to use at the county level to get the approval was written by U.S. Sugar, was sent to the Water Management District, where Drew Bartlett, the executive director, tweaked some of the language. It was sent to him on Christmas Eve, tweaked some of the language, and then he sent that letter to Palm Beach County on New Year's Eve. And if you think that's coincidence, then you're not awake to politics. The reality is, and that letter said this site could be identified as a possible location for a water resource project. But it didn't say we've analyzed this project and it is viable. The applicant then took that site identification letter to Palm Beach County and sold it as we've got the approval that we needed for you to take your step. And so Palm Beach County unanimously voted. Dozens and dozens of people, fishing guides, all showed up, testified. Again, their time was cut down from 3 minutes to 30 seconds. They unanimously voted. What the chair of Palm Beach County Commission said, I've received thousands of emails about this. I'm not going to read them. It was like we were inconveniencing them and they were late to cocktail hour, and they voted to pass it and they issued it. Now the last stop is that permit from DEP. And so we currently have a call to action going on. If you go to our website, any of our social media, it takes you less than 45 seconds to complete the call to action. You put in your information, populates an email, sends an email to the governor and to the secretary of DEP, asking them not to issue that permit until at minimum, the Water Management District could do a full analysis on what the proposal is, and if it carries any benefits at all, which we suspect won't. The Army Corps of Engineers has issued a statement that they have concerns that this will jeopardize the integrity of the reservoir, blasting next to it for 30 years. Tens of thousands of Floridians have opposed it. Dozens of scientists, every member of the Everglades Coalition, over 68 environmental organizations have opposed it. And yet it's being fast-tracked through. So that's something that, people always ask, what can we do? Short term, right now, you can get as many people as you can to go take that action, to ask the governor to direct DEP not to issue that permit, revoke the permit. And then the other is here, just simply sign up for our newsletter, stay informed, educate yourself. We put a lot of resource. We built a very talented team to produce everything from written blogs to videos to podcasts, so that no matter how you like to receive your information, there's some format for you to do so, and then use your voice. So that is it. I know it's long-winded. I'm happy to take any questions. I don't know if we're way over time, but I appreciate the opportunity.